Beef is the most nutrient-dense food on the planet. It quite literally contains every single vitamin and mineral that we need in the perfect quantities. It is the ultimate superfood. In fact, for the last 500 days, every single meal I've eaten has included beef. But more recently, I came across some very interesting information, which has now changed the way I eat beef entirely. So in today's video, we are going to look at everything beef related and why you might actually be eating beef wrong. I'm confident that after watching this video, you'll have a new perspective on not only the type of beef you buy, but also how you prepare it and cook it. There are 5 main aspects of beef which we are going to look at today. The first part is whether or not it matters, if it's grass-fed or grain-fed. This debate is very interesting. Some argue that grain-fed beef is bad for you, linked to higher inflammation and lower quality fat. These people also claim that grass-fed beef is far superior in nutritional quality compared to grain-fed beef. But on the other side, there are those who prefer grain-fed, praising its taste, affordability, and higher fat content. So who's actually right? Firstly, is grain-fed beef actually bad for you? The reason it's claimed that grain-fed beef is unhealthy is because the cow is not fed its species-appropriate diet. Cows are meant to eat grass. When a cow eats grass, it can extract all the nutrients from it and is able to break it down perfectly. It is very important that a species is able to effectively break down what it eats. If it doesn't, what happens is the animal becomes very unhealthy. We can see this when we examine their fat. An unhealthy animal will have very high quantities of the omega-6 fatty acids such as linoleic acid. This is a problem because when we eat this, it is inflammatory to us. Now when it comes to chicken and pork, this is a big problem. When these animals are fed grains, the amount of linoleic acid increases significantly. Ideally, we want linoleic acid to be roughly 2%, but in grain-fed chicken and pork, it's typically 14%, sometimes it gets as high as 20%. The reason for this is chickens and pigs are what is known as monogastric animals. This means they only have a single compartmented stomach. This type of stomach is very ineffective at breaking foods down. So if they eat something which is not exactly what they are meant to eat, their skin and their fat gets a massive buildup of these inflammatory fatty acids. But cows are not this way. They are what is known as ruminant animals. This means their stomach has 4 different chambers. Because of this, they are able to ferment and break down whatever they are fed very effectively, which is why we see both grain and grass-fed beef have relatively low levels of linoleic acid. For grass-fed, it's typically between 1 and 2%, and for grain-fed, it's typically between 2 and 4%. So even though grass-fed beef has slightly less linoleic acid, it doesn't seem to make too much of a difference regarding the bad stuff each contains. The other factor to consider is how much good stuff is there in grain-fed beef compared to grass-fed. So is it true that grass-fed meat contains more nutrients? Well, it would make sense. Grass is much more nutrient dense than these grains, which are often filled with terrible ingredients. So you'd think when a cow eats grass that its meat would contain significantly more nutrients. But this doesn't seem to be the case. What we see is that both grass and grain-fed beef seem to be almost identical in every nutrient. The only significant difference is that grass-fed beef is higher in the healthy omega-3 fatty acids. The reason they have such a similar nutrient profile is because even when a cow is grain-fed, it still eats grass for at least 70 to 80% of its life. Grain-fed cows are only fed grains at the end of their life to fatten them up. Interestingly enough, the diet they are fed to fatten them up looks almost identical to our food pyramid. It's almost like the people who made it created it in a way so everyone would get fat and sick and they could make lots of money. I'm sure that's not what actually happened. Anyways, enough conspiracy talk, back to business. Grass-fed is slightly better due to its fatty acid content, but as a whole, they are pretty similar. You can also buy organic beef, but all that means is the grains that they were fed did not have any pesticides on them. But because a cow's digestive system is so complex, this makes only a very minor difference. The final question we need to look at in this grass versus grain-fed equation is why are there so many people who actually prefer the taste of grain-fed? Well, it's simple. Humans love the taste of fat. Talk to any chef, it's their secret weapon. This makes perfect sense because we need fat to survive. It builds our hormones and provides us with energy. So of course it's going to taste incredible. That's the main reason. But it's also a personal preference thing. Because they are fed slightly differently, their meat is made from slightly different things. As a result, they do have slightly different tastes. I know people who have strong preferences for one or the other. When you're on a carnivore diet and you eat only meat, a slight difference in taste makes it seem like you are eating a completely different food. Every time I get meat cooked for me, I can tell you exactly what store it came from just by the taste alone. So even though the difference in taste is slight, for many you can prefer one or the other. Okay, so far we know that grain-fed and grass-fed beef are great options. But what about the cut of beef? Does it really matter? Are the cheaper cuts worse for you? Do they still contain the same amount of nutrients? Why are some so much cheaper than others? Well, they are cheaper for two reasons. For one, tenderness. For some reason, everyone seems to love tender beef. Many people think I'm odd because I actually prefer the chewier cuts of beef. I'm not the biggest fan of my steak falling apart in my mouth when I've barely chewed it, so I prefer the chewier cuts. But for most people, tenderness is a big factor. And then flavor also plays a key role. This is why cuts like ribeye are so expensive. Very tender and very flavoursome. But the truth is, every cut of beef actually has a virtually identical nutrient profile. So it doesn't really matter if you get the cheapest ground beef or prime Wagyu ribeye where the cows were sung to. It really is simply about what you prefer and what fits your budget. One thing I will say, however, is that it's a good idea, especially if you're young, to eat steak at least on occasion rather than only eating ground beef. Nowadays, there are a lot of people with very underdeveloped jaws. A large factor for this is because most people barely chew anything when growing up. When your diet is mainly bread, oats, other grains, and other processed food in general, you essentially slurp every meal, so you never develop your jaw. So that right there is definitely something you want to consider. Okay, so now we know everything about buying beef, except whether or not we should get aged beef. Let's look at that. Aged beef can actually be a major problem for some people. When beef is aged, it loses moisture, which gives it a more concentrated flavor. It also becomes more tender as proteins and connective tissue start to break down. This is why many people prefer aged beef. But due to bacterial activity during this aging, it has higher histamine levels. Histamine is a compound involved in immune responses, digestion, and neurotransmission. But excess levels can cause allergic-like symptoms, such as headaches, hives, or digestive issues in some people. So aged beef can be problematic for people with histamine intolerance. I know people who, when they have aged beef, they simply feel terrible and their skin breaks out. So again, this is person to person. If you like the taste of aged beef, great. A lot of people do. But for others, they prefer the fresher taste of non-aged beef. And if you noticed you don't feel as good eating aged beef due to these histamines, you will probably want fresher, non-aged beef. In terms of nutrients and fatty acid profile, aged beef is essentially exactly the same as non-aged beef. Now we have the perfect cut of beef for our liking. It's time to cook this bad boy. Get it on the grill, maybe the oven, whatever you like really. But actually, there are two very important factors to consider here. Firstly, cooking fats. The cooking fat you use can actually make a massive difference. Many of you will know Kerry from the YouTube channel Homestead Hound. Kerry had depression his entire life, but he went on carnivore and like magic, it completely went away. That was until one day he went on a cruise. Now on this cruise, he had to get all his meals cooked for him. So unfortunately, they cooked these meals in refined seed oils. So what happened is, despite nothing in his life changing, Kerry's depression came back to the point that he didn't even want to leave his room. This right here is a great example of just how important it is to cook your beef in the right type of fat. Let's compare the main options that people use: seed oils, olive and avocado oil, as well as animal fats such as butter, ghee, tallow, and lard. Let's start with seed oils. I don't even know where to begin with this one. This stuff is man-made chemical sludge. To make these things, it's quite literally an 11-step process. They have to get the seeds, press them, heat them up, bring the temperature back down, deodorize them, bleach them, add some other chemical solvents. It's a complete disgrace. They are ridiculously high in linoleic acid. They're also very prone to oxidization, which basically means when they're exposed to oxygen or heat, they become very unstable. The chemical structure changes, which produces free radicals, which cause damage to our cells, proteins in our body, as well as our DNA. These things are terrible, avoid at all costs. Next up, we're going to look at olive oil and avocado oil. Now, these aren't as bad, but they're still way too high in linoleic acid. We want it to be around 2%, which is evolutionary appropriate, meaning that's how much we consumed typically throughout our history, so that's how much we can tolerate. Another thing with olive oil is that it's probably not real. There are not enough olive trees in the world to make all of the olive oil that's in stores. So very sneakily, they add seed oils to the olive oil and don't tell anyone. Many companies have been called out for doing this, but even if they don't do this, it's still too high in that linoleic acid. So, butter and ghee. Both, as we know, are dairy products. The difference between the two is that ghee has had its milk solids and water removed. As a result, it's a lot easier for people who are intolerant to dairy to handle. This is because it's almost entirely free of lactose and casein. But if you aren't dairy sensitive, both are great. Very low in linoleic acid, very high in the healthy fats, both incredible options. Next up, we have tallow, which is literally rendered beef fat. Beef fat, along with beef in general, is the healthiest food you can possibly eat. So again, another great option. Okay, what about lard? Lard can also be great. Lard is pig fat. Again, this can also be a great option. The only problem with lard is that it often comes from grain-fed pigs. As a result, it can also be incredibly high in that linoleic acid. Now, if you get lard that comes from a pig that was pasture-raised, meaning it was allowed to roam in pasture and eat its natural diet, lard would also be an incredible option. As a whole, the best type of fat you can eat is any animal fat. Ideally, however, if it does come from a monogastric animal, such as a pig, chicken, or even duck, then you might want to consider what that animal has been fed. So now we know what type of beef we should buy and what we should cook it in. This leaves us with one final question. How can we cook this beef so that it remains as nutrient dense as possible? When beef is cooked, the water-soluble vitamins, including all the B vitamins and vitamin C, along with minerals such as iron, zinc, sodium, can be lost in the juices that escape. In fact, in this study here, they found that roughly 30% of these vitamins and minerals were lost when cooking a steak well done. So that's one thing to consider. Now remember, this happens on a continuum, meaning if you cook a steak completely well done, it will lose 30%. If you eat it raw, it will be 0%. So then if you have a steak, say medium rare, you might lose 10 to 12%. So maybe you do want to have it on the rarer side, but I don't think this is a huge deal. You can also just drink the broth from the pan. These nutrients don't just evaporate in thin air. When it comes to the best cooking method, it probably doesn't matter too much. But if you are going to say boil or broil your meat, then it's probably a good idea to drink the broth at the end, just so you're not missing out on all these vitamins and minerals. I think it's best just to have your steak how you like it. What you'll probably find, however, is that as time goes on, you start to prefer it rarer and rarer. The reason for this is because the rarer steak has more nutrients in it. Your body gets incredibly positively rewarded by this. So over time, the rarer the steak is, it just seems to taste better. I personally noticed this. When I first started carnivore, I'd have my steaks medium, sometimes even closer to well done. Whereas now my favorite type of steak is where I just sear the outsides and the inside is completely raw. It's also a good idea to be getting the higher fat steaks. Fat is what builds our hormones. It's also the best possible energy source that we can give our body. If you're not eating enough fat, you're just not going to feel anywhere near your best. So it's settled. Grass-fed is only slightly better than grain-fed. Choose the cut of beef you like with enough fat. Decide the age of the beef based on personal preference. Cook the beef in some sort of animal fat, and ideally have it on the rarer side, or drink the bone broth if you don't like it rarer. Anyways, hope you've been well. Ideally, you learned something new, and I'll see you next time.